The alarm on my wrist did not beep. It screamed. I was standing in the mess hall of the orbital station above New Meridian when the signal broke through every channel at once. My cup of coffee was still warm in my hand. My sister Ellen was down there, 300 kilometers below me, teaching children how to read in a colony school built from imported wood and borrowed hope. Then the feed from the surface went white. Not static. White. A clean, bright, total white. The kind of light that means something is burning so completely that there is nothing left to send a picture of. I remember dropping the cup. I remember the sound of it breaking on the floor, small and stupid and far away, like it belonged to someone else's life. I remember Commander Priya Anand grabbing my shoulder and saying my name twice before I heard her the first time. Kale, Kale, look at me. I could not look at her. I was looking at the screen, at the place where a colony of 40,000 people had been broadcasting a very ordinary morning, only 90 seconds earlier. A weather report, a children's song, my sister's voice, recorded the night before in a message she had sent me, still unopened in my inbox, waiting for me to have a free hour. I never got that hour. We learned later, piece by piece, that a coalition of species calling themselves the Threshold Compact had reached New Meridian's system and decided, without a single word of warning, that our colony sat on a mineral field they wanted. They did not send a demand. They did not send a warning shot. They erased the colony the way you might erase a mistake on a page, quickly and without looking back to see what was lost. There was no declaration of war. There was no ultimatum. There was only silence, and then there was nothing at all. I sat in a debriefing room 3 hours later, while officers from 4 different Alliance species offered their condolences in 4 different languages, all of them polite, all of them distant, all of them already moving on to the next item on the agenda. One of them, a tall being with silver eyes named Vorik Thal, patted the table near my hand instead of touching me, since he did not know if human skin allowed such things, and said something that translated roughly to, "This is regrettable. Newer species often suffer such losses before they are recognized. It will pass. It will pass." I looked at him and I understood, in that moment, something that would define the rest of my life and the life of every human born after me. To the wider galaxy, we were young, we were unlisted, we were unprotected, and because of that, we were expendable, a rounding error in someone else's resource calculation. They expected us to grieve for a while, bury our dead, and then quietly accept our place at the bottom of a very old and very cold order. They did not know humans yet. I did not shout. I did not break anything else that day. I went back to my quarters, and I opened the message my sister had sent me the night before she died, and I listened to her voice tell me about the children in her class, about a boy named Robin Ashford who wanted to be a pilot, about how she planned to visit me next spring if the shuttle schedules allowed it. I saved that message. I did not delete it. I would never delete it. And somewhere in that quiet, grieving hour, without meaning to, I made a decision that millions of other humans across 100 stations and colonies were making at the very same moment, independently, without any order from above. We would not forget. Not her name. Not the names of the 40,000 who died with her. Not the name of a single soul who was lost that day, or any day after. You expected us to grieve and forget. You did not know that humans do not forget. We archive. 3 months after New Meridian, I stood in a converted shipyard hangar on Earth and watched the first stone of a strange new building being placed by hand. Not by machine, by hand. An old man named Callum Reeve, who had lost 2 grandchildren in the colony, insisted on setting that first stone himself, and nobody stopped him. They called the building the Hall of the Unforgotten. At the time, most people outside our species assumed it was simply a memorial, a place for grieving families to visit, light a candle, and slowly move past their pain the way older species insisted we should. Ambassador Vorik Thal actually laughed when he heard about it, a polite, careful laugh meant to be gentle, and told a room full of Alliance officials that humans were writing poems for the dead instead of building warships, and that this was, in his words, a charming but ultimately wasteful use of resources during a time of vulnerability. He was wrong. He simply did not understand what he was looking at. The Hall of the Unforgotten was not only a memorial, it was the beginning of something the rest of the galaxy had never built before, because no other species had ever needed to build it. It was an archive, yes, but a living one, powered by an artificial intelligence system we named Keeper, whose only purpose was to record, permanently and without exception, the name, the face, the voice, and the final known moment of every single human who died as a result of violence, anywhere in known space, for any reason, at any time. I remember the day Keeper went active. I was there, standing beside Priya Anand, who had transferred from active fleet duty to help oversee the project, because after New Meridian, she said she could no longer look at a battle plan without first understanding what, exactly, we were fighting to remember. The first entry Keeper ever logged was my sister, Ellen Voss, age 29, teacher. Last known words, recorded from the message she sent me the night before she died. Her photograph, her voice, her laugh, pulled from an old recording taken at a family gathering years earlier. I watched her file appear on the screen, and I felt something shift inside my chest, something between grief and resolve, like a door closing on one kind of pain and opening onto another kind of purpose. What the rest of the galaxy did not understand, not yet, was that the Hall of the Unforgotten was never designed to let grief fade quietly with time. It was designed to preserve it, perfectly, forever, and to attach every single lost name to a permanent record that our military doctrine would treat as an open and unclosed account. There was no statute of limitations written into Keeper's programming. There could not be. Every commander, every official, every decision-maker connected to a human death by violence was logged alongside the victim, cross-referenced, documented, and preserved with the same permanence as the names of the dead themselves. Other species built weapons to project power. We built a memory system, and only afterward did we understand that memory, kept perfectly and honestly for long enough, becomes one of the most powerful weapons a civilization can hold. I remember explaining this to a young Alliance diplomat named Sana Ilun, who visited the hall not long after it opened, curious and a little uneasy about what she called our unusual approach to loss. She asked me why humans insisted on remembering every single name individually instead of simply honoring the dead collectively, the way most species did, with a single monument or a single day of remembrance each year. I told her that a name spoken once and then folded into a crowd of nameless dead is a name that can eventually be forgotten. A name recorded individually, with a face and a voice and a story attached, cannot be quietly erased by time, by politics, or by the slow patience of an old species hoping a young one will simply move on. She did not fully understand then. Very few outside our species did. What followed the founding of the Hall was not a declaration of war, not immediately. It was something slower, and in hindsight, far more unsettling to the beings who eventually came to understand it. Humanity did not rage. We organized. Shipyards that had been building modest defensive vessels for local system protection began quietly expanding their production lines. Research stations that had been focused on agricultural technology and medical advancement redirected a portion of their funding toward materials science and propulsion research. Colonization efforts on hostile, previously overlooked worlds accelerated, not for resource extraction, but because Keeper's projections indicated that a larger, more distributed human population would be a population far harder to erase in a single strike ever again. Every project, every new colony, every new class of vessel launched in those years carried a small inscription somewhere on its hull or in its founding documents. New Meridian remembered. I was assigned, a year after the hall opened, to a small research and coordination unit working directly beneath Commander Anand, whose quiet, methodical leadership style had earned her a reputation among human officers as someone who never raised her voice and never needed to. Our unit's task was simple to describe and endless in its actual scope, cross-referencing every incident report, every trade dispute, every border skirmish involving human colonies, and feeding the details into Keeper so that no single loss, however small, would ever be filed away and forgotten in some dusty administrative record. It was during this period that I met Daniel Ashford, a systems engineer whose younger brother Robin, the very boy who had once told my sister Ellen he wanted to be a pilot, had died alongside her on New Meridian. Daniel had thrown himself into the hall's technical development with an intensity that worried some of his supervisors, working impossible hours, refusing extended leave, insisting that every line of code he wrote was somehow a small act of protection for a brother he could no longer protect in any other way. I understood him completely. I did not try to slow him down. Instead, I worked beside him, and together we built something Keeper's original designers had not initially planned, a secondary function within the archive that recorded not only losses, but also acts of genuine kindness, alliance, and sacrifice performed by non-human beings on behalf of humans, in equal and permanent detail. Daniel asked me once, late at night in an otherwise empty research bay, why I insisted on building that second function when our grief was so entirely focused on loss. I told him that if we were going to build a memory that never faded, it needed to be an honest one, capable of holding both the debts owed to us and the debts we owed in return. A memory that only remembered harm would eventually become something cruel and unbalanced. A memory that remembered everything, fairly and completely, would become something the rest of the galaxy could eventually trust, even if they feared it. He did not answer me that night. He simply nodded and kept working. By the time the second anniversary of New Meridian arrived, the Hall of the Unforgotten held records for over 200,000 names, most of them civilians lost across dozens of smaller, previously unreported incidents that Keeper's cross-referencing system had uncovered, incidents that other species had assumed, correctly in most cases, would simply be forgotten by a young, distracted, grieving population. They were not forgotten, not one of them. Ambassador Vorik Thal visited the hall himself during that anniversary, invited by Commander Anand as part of an ongoing diplomatic effort to keep tensions from boiling over into open conflict before humanity was fully prepared. I watched him walk slowly through the main archive chamber, past wall after wall of names projected in soft, steady light, each one accompanied by a face, a voice recording playing at a barely audible volume, and a short account of a life that had been cut short. He stopped in front of my sister's entry. I do not know if he recognized the name or simply paused because something about the way the light fell on her photograph caught his attention. He stood there for a long moment, and for the first time since I had met him, he did not offer a polite, careful comment meant to smooth over an uncomfortable topic. He asked, quietly, how many names the hall expected to hold in another decade. I told him honestly that we did not know, and that the number depended entirely on choices the wider galaxy had not yet made. I told him that every name already recorded represented a debt that would never expire, never be forgiven through simple passage of time, and never be quietly closed through diplomatic convenience. He asked if that meant humanity intended to seek retribution for every single one. I told him that intention was not the right word. It was simpler than that. It was structural. Every name in that hall was permanently linked, through Keeper, to every available record concerning how that person died and who was responsible. That information did not disappear when a treaty was signed or a war officially ended. It remained patient and complete, ready to be acted upon whenever the opportunity presented itself, whether that opportunity came in 1 year or in 100. I watched something change in his expression that day, something between unease and a grudging, dawning respect. He had come to the hall expecting to see sentimental weakness, the kind of emotional indulgence he associated with younger, less disciplined species. Instead, he saw infrastructure. He saw an entire civilization quietly converting grief into permanent, patient, unbreakable resolve, and for the first time, I think he understood that the laughter he had offered 2 years earlier had been a terrible mistake. 10 years after New Meridian, I stood on the bridge of a vessel called the Steadfast Reckoning, no longer a grieving young officer sitting in a debriefing room, but a senior tactical coordinator attached to what the Alliance fleets had started calling, quietly and with some unease, the Retribution Fleet. We were approaching a border colony belonging to the Threshold Compact, the same coalition responsible for New Meridian, and every person on that bridge, human and otherwise, knew exactly why we were there. Commander Anand, now leading the fleet herself, stood at the center of the bridge with the same calm, measured composure I remembered from the day the Hall of the Unforgotten first went active. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Every operation we ran had been planned with a precision that made our allied species visibly uncomfortable, because it was so entirely without the anger they expected from us. Keeper had spent a decade cross-referencing every scrap of available evidence connected to New Meridian and the incidents that followed it, identifying commanders, officials, and decision-makers with a completeness that no other species had ever applied to a single military campaign. We were not simply attacking a border colony, we were executing a carefully documented, thoroughly verified operation against specific individuals who bore direct responsibility for what happened to my sister and 39,999 other people. I remember Daniel Ashford's voice over the comm channel, calm and precise, guiding a small strike team toward a command facility where Keeper's records indicated a former Compact officer named Draith Cole was stationed, the very officer who had authorized the destruction of New Meridian a decade earlier. I was part of that strike team. I had requested it personally, and Commander Anand had approved it, not out of sentiment, but because she understood that some debts deserved to be settled by the people who carried them longest. The facility's defenses were significant, but Keeper's decade of patient documentation meant we knew every structural detail, every routine, every weakness in their operational schedule before we ever arrived. We moved through the facility with a discipline that surprised even our own allied observers, avoiding unnecessary confrontation wherever possible, focused entirely on our objective. I found Draith Cole in a lower command chamber, alone, having sent his remaining staff away once he understood the facility's outer defenses had failed. He was older than I expected, his silver skin dulled with age, his posture no longer carrying the confident authority I imagined he once held when he gave the order that erased my sister's colony. He asked, through a translation device clipped to his collar, for a quick end to the confrontation. He said he understood humanity's anger and did not wish to prolong it unnecessarily. I told him that humanity did not do quick anymore, not because we wished to cause him suffering, but because quick endings were exactly what allowed atrocities like New Meridian to be filed away and forgotten by history. I told him that every detail of his decision a decade earlier had already been documented by Keeper, cross-referenced against surviving witnesses, communication logs recovered from the colony's final transmissions, and testimony gathered from members of his own former staff who had since spoken to Alliance investigators. I did not deliver justice to him myself. That was never the point, and Commander Anand had made this clear to every member of the Retribution Fleet before the operation began. Instead, I placed him under formal custody and transferred him directly into the Alliance War Courts, along with the complete, time-stamped, absolutely thorough evidence file Keeper had spent 10 years assembling. There was no need for anger in that room. The evidence spoke with a weight and completeness that anger could never have achieved. The trial that followed, conducted under Joint Alliance oversight, became one of the most closely watched proceedings in recent galactic history, not because of any dramatic revelation, but because of the sheer, overwhelming completeness of the case humanity presented. Every witness Keeper had identified was still available to testify. Every communication log was still intact. Every timestamp aligned perfectly with the sequence of events that led to New Meridian's destruction. Other species watched that trial with a growing, quiet unease. They had expected humanity to seek vengeance through force alone, the way many young, wounded civilizations eventually did, driven by grief into reckless, disorganized retaliation that would ultimately weaken us and justify further dismissal from the wider alliance. Instead, they watched a civilization present a case so complete, so patiently documented across an entire decade, that Draeth Cole's own legal representatives struggled to find any grounds for appeal. I remember Vorik Thal attending several sessions of that trial, seated quietly among the Alliance observers, his expression unreadable in the way that species' faces often were to human eyes. After the verdict was delivered, he approached me in a corridor outside the courtroom and asked, with what I recognize now as genuine curiosity rather than polite condescension, how humanity had managed to maintain such discipline for an entire decade without the resolve fading. I told him the truth. It had not faded because it was never meant to. Keeper did not experience fatigue, distraction, or the slow erosion of memory that eventually softened grief in most living beings. Every name in the Hall of the Unforgotten remained as clear, as complete, and as present as the day it was first recorded, and as long as that archive existed, humanity's resolve would remain equally undimmed. He asked if this meant the Retribution Fleet intended to pursue every remaining individual connected to New Meridian, regardless of how long it took. I told him yes, without hesitation. Keeper's records indicated 14 additional individuals still bearing direct responsibility for decisions made that day, scattered across compact territory, some in hiding, some still serving in official capacities under the mistaken assumption that a decade of silence meant humanity had moved on. They were wrong, and over the following years, one by one, each of those 14 individuals was located, documented, and transferred into Alliance judicial custody through operations that grew steadily more efficient as our fleet's experience and Keeper's cross-referencing capabilities continued to improve. What struck our allied species most during this period was not the eventual outcome of these operations, which they had come to expect, but the complete absence of escalation or excess in how we conducted them. We did not pursue collateral punishment against compact civilians uninvolved in the original decision. We did not expand our operations beyond the specific, documented individuals Keeper had identified. We did not allow grief to become an excuse for indiscriminate action. This precision unsettled the wider galaxy far more than uncontrolled anger ever could have. A species driven by rage alone was predictable, and predictability meant vulnerability that other civilizations could exploit or wait out. A species driven by patient, permanent, meticulously documented resolve was something the galaxy had never encountered before, and they did not yet know how to plan around it. I remember a moment near the end of that campaign, standing beside Daniel Ashford in the observation deck of the Steadfast Reckoning, watching the final individual on Keeper's New Meridian list being transferred into custody on a viewscreen feed. Daniel had aged visibly over the decade, the same intensity still present in his eyes, but tempered now by something closer to quiet satisfaction than the raw grief I remembered from our earliest nights working together in the research bay. He asked me if I felt any different, now that every name connected to that single, devastating decision a decade earlier had finally been held accountable. I told him honestly that I did not feel the relief I once expected to feel. My sister was still gone. Robin Ashford was still gone. 40,000 people were still gone, and no amount of accountability, however complete, could undo that loss. But I told him something else too, something I had come to understand slowly over 10 years of carrying that particular grief. The completeness of what we had done meant that no other family, on any other colony, would ever again wonder whether their loss had simply been filed away and forgotten. Keeper remembered, the Hall remembered, and as long as we continued building on that foundation, every future loss, however painful, would carry the same permanent, unbreakable promise of accountability. That, I told him, was not the same as relief, but it was something close to purpose, and after 10 years, purpose was enough to keep moving forward. 25 years after New Meridian, I found myself invited to a gathering I never expected to attend, a joint conference of Alliance representatives convened specifically to discuss what several delegates were now openly calling the human question, a polite phrase covering a topic that had grown increasingly difficult for the wider galaxy to ignore. By then, the Hall of the Unforgotten held records for over 4 million names, gathered not only from major incidents like New Meridian, but from thousands of smaller conflicts, border disputes, and previously overlooked losses that Keeper's tireless cross-referencing had steadily uncovered across a quarter-century of careful, patient work. What had changed over those years was not humanity's resolve, which remained exactly as complete and undimmed as it had been at the founding of the Hall. What had changed was the wider galaxy's understanding of what that resolve actually meant, and how it was reshaping the behavior of civilizations who had once assumed we would eventually tire, fade, and settle quietly into our expected place at the bottom of the Alliance hierarchy. I sat near the back of the conference chamber, no longer young, my hair beginning to gray at the temples, listening as representative after representative described how their own species had begun altering long-standing policies out of a caution they were reluctant to fully name. A delegate from a mineral trading coalition explained that their organization had implemented mandatory review processes for any operation near human territory, not because of any specific threat, but because the mere possibility of an undocumented incident being uncovered by Keeper decades later had become an unacceptable risk to their standing within the Alliance. I remember Sana Ilun, the young diplomat I had first met at the Hall many years earlier, now a senior Alliance representative herself, standing to address the chamber with a clarity and confidence that reminded me she had grown considerably since our first conversation about names and remembrance. She told the assembled delegates that humanity's true innovation was never simply the archive itself, but the discipline with which we maintained it. Other species, she explained, had built memorials before. Other species had certainly sought accountability for wrongs committed against them. What made humanity unusual was our refusal to let either grief or resolve fade with the passage of time, and our willingness to apply that same permanent standard to acts of kindness and alliance as readily as we applied it to acts of harm. She was right, and I had watched that balance play out personally, many times, over the preceding decades. I thought of Commander Anand, now retired from active fleet duty but still serving as an advisor to the Hall's ongoing operations, who had once told me that the second function Daniel Ashford and I built into Keeper, the one recording debts of gratitude alongside debts of harm, had done more to reshape humanity's relationship with the wider galaxy than any military campaign ever could. I thought of a particular entry in that gratitude archive, one I had personally reviewed many times over the years, recording the actions of a compact engineer named Yeshka Vol, who had risked significant personal consequence to warn a human research outpost of an impending resource dispute before it escalated into violence, saving perhaps 200 lives through a single quiet act of conscience decades earlier. Keeper had recorded her name with the same permanence and completeness as any entry in the primary archive, and when Yeshka Vol passed away peacefully many years later, a human delegation attended her memorial, uninvited but welcomed, to formally acknowledge a debt that had never been forgotten. This balance I came to understand through the conference and through countless smaller moments across those 25 years was precisely what made humanity's growing influence across the Alliance so difficult for other species to categorize using their existing understanding of power and diplomacy. A young diplomat from a species I did not recognize approached me during a break in the proceedings, introducing himself simply as an observer, curious about human customs. He asked me, with a directness I appreciated after so many years of careful diplomatic language, whether humanity intended to ever stop, whether there was some eventual point at which the Hall of the Unforgotten would be considered complete, its purpose fulfilled, its resolve finally allowed to rest. I told him honestly that stopping was not quite the right way to think about it. The Hall would never stop recording, because loss, unfortunately, would never entirely stop occurring across a galaxy as vast and complicated as ours. But I told him something I had come to believe deeply over the preceding decades, something I think surprised him. I told him the Hall was not built from a desire for endless conflict. It was built from a refusal to let injustice or kindness pass by unnoticed and unanswered. As Alliance civilizations continued adjusting their behavior in response to that permanent standard, as fewer undocumented incidents occurred near human territory, as more species began extending the same careful consideration to us that they had once reserved only for older, more established civilizations. The primary archive's rate of new entries had already begun, slowly but measurably, to decline. This, I explained, was the actual goal, though few outside our species initially understood it. We had never sought endless retribution for its own sake. We had sought a galaxy where no civilization felt safe, assuming a loss could simply be erased by time, and as that understanding spread, the underlying behavior that once made such archives necessary had genuinely begun to change. He asked if I believed that change was sincere, or simply a cautious accommodation born from fear of consequence. I told him I did not entirely know, and that perhaps the distinction mattered less than he expected. Whether a civilization changed its behavior out of genuine moral growth or out of careful, self-interested caution, the practical result for potential victims was often the same: fewer undocumented losses, fewer decisions made under the false assumption that distance and time would erase accountability. I thought, as I said this, of Ambassador Vorik Thal, who had passed away several years earlier after a long career largely spent, in his later years, advocating for closer, more careful alliance policy regarding human territory. A considerable shift from the dismissive comments he had once offered so easily in the years following New Meridian. I had attended his memorial, invited by his successor, and had stood quietly at the back of the gathering, remembering the moment he stood before my sister's entry in the Hall of the Unforgotten and asked, for the first time, with genuine curiosity rather than polite condescension, how many names the archive expected to hold in another decade. I never got the chance to tell him the final number reached by that particular decade, though I suspect he had already begun to understand, long before his passing, that the number itself was never really the point. The conference continued for several more days, delegates from dozens of species debating policy adjustments, trade agreements, and diplomatic protocols increasingly shaped around the quiet, permanent presence of an archive that never forgot and never fully closed a single account. I did not speak often during those sessions, content to listen, to observe how thoroughly the galaxy's understanding of humanity had shifted across a single generation. We were no longer viewed as a young, vulnerable species, ripe for careless resource harvesting, the assumption that had cost my sister and 39,999 others their lives 25 years earlier. We were viewed now by most civilizations who had taken the time to understand us properly as something closer to an incorruptible memory given form and purpose, a civilization that simply refused to let time erase either injustice or genuine kindness, regardless of how many years or decades separated the act from its eventual acknowledgement. This reputation complicated the simpler narratives some had tried to construct about us in the years immediately following our early retribution campaigns. We were not, as some fearful commentators had once suggested, a species defined purely by unrelenting vengeance. Nor were we, as some overly optimistic allies had hoped, a species who would eventually set aside our grief and settle comfortably into forgetting, the way so many other civilizations across the galaxy's long history had done before us. We were something the galaxy had genuinely never encountered before, and by the time that conference concluded, I believe most delegates in that chamber had finally begun to understand it correctly, not as a threat to be carefully managed, but as a permanent, unwavering standard that the wider alliance itself had slowly, cautiously, and in many cases genuinely, begun to adopt as their own. 50 years after New Meridian, I stood once more in the main chamber of the Hall of the Unforgotten, though very little about the building resembled the modest structure Callum Reeve had helped lay the first stone for so many decades earlier. The hall now orbited a fully rebuilt New Meridian, a colony that had grown, over half a century, into one of humanity's most celebrated worlds, its population drawn not only from human families who had chosen to settle there in quiet, deliberate defiance of what had once been taken from us, but from families of several allied species as well, who had come to view residency on New Meridian as a meaningful gesture of solidarity and shared remembrance. I was old now, my hair fully gray, my hands slower than they once were, though my mind remained sharp enough to appreciate the strange, quiet symmetry of standing exactly where I had stood as a much younger man, watching a wall of names stretch endlessly before me, each one still perfectly preserved, still accompanied by a face, a voice, and a story that 50 years had done nothing to diminish. Commander Anand had passed away peacefully several years earlier, at a considerable age, having spent her final decades mentoring a new generation of fleet officers in the same calm, methodical discipline that had defined the Retribution fleet's earliest and most consequential campaigns. Her name was recorded in the hall as well, not among the lost, but in a separate, honored section reserved for those who had dedicated their lives to ensuring the Archive's mission was carried out with fairness, precision, and restraint. Daniel Ashford, now himself an old man walking with the aid of a cane, had joined me that day for what had become an annual tradition neither of us ever missed, regardless of how far our respective duties across the Alliance had taken us over the decades. We stood together before two entries, side by side, exactly as they had always been recorded. My sister, Ellen Voss. His brother, Robin Ashford, the boy who once told her he wanted to be a pilot, and who, I had learned many years earlier through a quiet addition to his file that Daniel insisted on adding personally, would have turned 39 years old that very week, had his life not been cut short on a morning that began, for him, with nothing more unusual than an ordinary lesson in an ordinary classroom. I read her name aloud, as I had done every year for half a century, my voice steadier now than it had been in earlier decades, though the weight behind the words had never once grown lighter. Elin Voss. Daniel, beside me, spoke his brother's name in turn, and for a long moment we simply stood together in silence. Two old men who had built an unlikely friendship from a shared, devastating loss, and who had spent the better part of their lives ensuring that loss would never be permitted to fade into the comfortable forgetting that time so often offered to those willing to accept it. Later that afternoon, a formal delegation from the successor government of the former Threshold Compact arrived at New Meridian, an event that had been carefully arranged months in advance through painstaking diplomatic negotiation, and one that drew considerable attention from observers across the wider alliance. The Compact, restructured decades earlier under Joint Alliance oversight following the conclusion of our early Retribution campaigns, had spent much of the intervening half-century working to rebuild both its internal governance and its standing among other civilizations, a process that had required, among many other things, a full and formal reckoning with the events of New Meridian, presented not through vague diplomatic language, but through the same complete, thoroughly documented account that Keeper had assembled all those decades earlier. I stood among the assembled human representatives as the Compact's current leader, a younger member of their species named Thren Cole, distant descendant of the very officer I had personally taken into custody 50 years earlier, delivered a formal statement acknowledging the full scope of what had occurred on New Meridian, accepting complete responsibility on behalf of their government, and expressing a sincere commitment to ensuring no future decision by their civilization would ever again treat another species' lives as an acceptable cost of resource acquisition. I watched Thren Cole's expression carefully as they spoke, searching for any sign of the polite, distant condescension I remembered so vividly from Ambassador Vorik Thal's early comments, or the cold calculation I remembered from Draith Cole's final, desperate request for a quick resolution to his own reckoning decades earlier. I found neither. I found instead something that looked genuinely, carefully, like understanding, the kind that could only be earned through 50 years of consequence, accountability, and the slow, patient work of a civilization that had refused to let a single name be forgotten. After the formal proceedings concluded, Thren Cole approached me directly, requesting a private moment I had not expected, and, if I am honest, was not entirely certain I wished to grant. They asked if I would be willing to walk with them through the hall, to see, in person, the full record of what their civilization's decision had cost mine. I agreed, and we walked together in relative silence through the main archive chamber, past wall after wall of names, each one still glowing with the same soft, steady light I remembered from the day the hall first opened its doors. We stopped, eventually, before my sister's entry, and Thren Cole stood there for a long moment, much as Vorik Thal once had, though with an expression far more openly troubled than the careful diplomatic mask I remembered from that earlier visit. They asked me, quietly, whether I believed 50 years of accountability had been enough to settle the debt their predecessor's decision had created. I told them honestly what I had come to understand across a lifetime spent building, maintaining, and eventually helping to lead the very archive we stood within. The debt itself, I explained, was never truly about settlement in the way they meant it. My sister was still gone. Robin Ashford was still gone. No amount of accountability, however complete, however patiently pursued across however many decades, could return what had been lost that day. What 50 years of accountability had accomplished, I told them, was something different, and in many ways more valuable than simple settlement. It had ensured that no other family, on any other colony, belonging to any other species, would ever again wonder whether their loss had been quietly filed away and forgotten by a galaxy too vast and too indifferent to remember every name. It had also, I told them, done something I doubt anyone fully anticipated in those earliest, grief-filled years following New Meridian's destruction. It had reshaped, slowly and permanently, the wider galaxy's understanding of what accountability actually required, encouraging dozens of civilizations, including their own, to build similar systems, similar archives, similar permanent standards of remembrance that extended the same careful consideration to species far smaller and far less powerful than their own. Thren Cole asked if this meant humanity considered the matter, at long last, closed. I told them the truth, the same truth I had told a curious young diplomat at that conference 25 years earlier, and the same truth I had come to understand more deeply with every passing year since. The Hall of the Unforgotten would never truly close, not because we sought endless grievance, but because loss, unfortunately, would likely never entirely disappear from a galaxy as vast, as complicated, and as populated with countless different civilizations as ours. But I told them something else, too, something I believed had genuinely changed across the 50 years since my sister's death. The rate of new entries requiring the kind of full retribution response our early campaigns once demanded had slowed to almost nothing in recent decades. Not because our resolve had weakened, but because the wider alliance had genuinely, measurably, begun treating human lives, and increasingly the lives of other smaller and more vulnerable species, with the same careful consideration once reserved only for the oldest and most powerful civilizations. This, I told Thren Cole, was the actual victory, quiet and unglamorous as it was, compared to the dramatic retribution campaigns of my younger years. Not endless conflict, but a permanent, unwavering standard that had genuinely reshaped how an entire galaxy conducted itself. One careful decision, one documented consequence, one remembered name at a time. Thren Cole left New Meridian later that same day, and I understood, watching their delegation's vessel depart, that the formal reckoning we had witnessed represented something genuinely significant, not the closing of an old wound, which could never fully close, but the completion of a long, difficult process that had finally allowed both civilizations to move forward, not through forgetting, but through full, honest, permanent acknowledgement of everything that had occurred. That evening, I returned to the main archive chamber alone, as I did most years after the annual gathering concluded, and the crowds of visitors, dignitaries, and fellow grieving family members had returned to their own homes and their own lives. I stood once more before my sister's entry, her photograph glowing softly in the quiet chamber, her recorded voice, if I chose to activate it, still ready to tell me about a boy named Robin Ashford who wanted to be a pilot, exactly as clearly as it had been 50 years earlier. I thought about everything that single, devastating loss had ultimately built, not just the archive itself, not just the shipyards and colonies and careful, patient military campaigns that followed, but something far larger and, I believed, far more important, a genuine, permanent shift in how an entire galaxy understood the value of every single life within it. I thought about young Sana Ilun, now an Elder Alliance representative herself, still occasionally visiting the hall to review its ongoing work. I thought about Daniel Ashford, walking slowly back toward the transport that would carry him home, carrying with him the same quiet, unbreakable resolve I remembered from our earliest nights together in that empty research bay 50 years earlier. I thought about Commander Anand and Ambassador Vorik Thal, both gone now, both remembered permanently within these very walls, their names recorded with the same careful completeness as every other soul who had shaped what humanity ultimately became. We were told, once, that the galaxy was too vast, too old, and too indifferent for any single civilization to remember every death that occurred within it. We were told that loss, on a scale as large as the galaxy itself, simply had to be accepted, mourned briefly, and then quietly set aside in favor of moving forward. We decided that this simply meant we needed a bigger memory, one large enough, patient enough, and permanent enough to hold every single name the galaxy tried to convince us we should eventually forget. And across 50 years, and every year since, humanity has never once been in short supply of that.